The American Bar Association is honored to be a sponsor and grateful for the privilege to participate with you at this gathering each year. The ABA shares your commitment to upholding the rule of law and to continuing the important work of building a strong international community dedicated to responding to atrocities. And we're pleased to be a partner with you in these discussions and the roundtable, and look forward to continuing to add our voice to these important discussions in the future. In a moment, I will read the first Chautauqua principles. The principles were informed by the discussions during the 4 breakout sessions held yesterday on the topics of the future of courts and tribunals, mechanisms, state implementation, intrastate cooperation, and regional courts, grassroots efforts, and the impact of populism and nationalism. I had the privilege of attending the 3rd breakout discussion on grassroots efforts yesterday, and in particular we talked quite a bit about how to engage with civilians and communities to better document atrocities. And I really greatly enjoyed that discussion, and it was a very rich discussion, and it included a lot of diverse perspectives and voices, including wonderful contributions from the high school, college, and law students who joined us. So it was really a special event, and I was very privileged to be able to join you here and participate in those discussions. I wish that I could have had the opportunity to attend all of the sessions yesterday, because the reports that we heard this morning showed how interesting and deep all of those discussions were, and how significant they were to the work that we do and continue to do in the future. And I look forward to being able to read more about those various discussions in the proceedings of the 13th Annual International Humanitarian Law Roundtable, which will be released after the conference concludes. At the conclusion of reading the first Chautauqua principles, I will ask Brenda J. Hollis, as chair of the sessions, to witness and sign the principles, and in doing so, call upon the international legal community to keep the spirit of the Nuremberg principles alive by calling attention to and putting into action the principles that we include within that first Chautauqua Principles document. Before continuing with that reading, I wanted to read just briefly from 2 individuals as we consider all the work that has been done over many years to get us to this place, the work that has occurred here over the last few days, and the significant work that remains for the future. The ABA Center for Human Rights bestowed its inaugural Eleanor Roosevelt Prize for Global Human Rights Achievement last year to 2 individuals, one of whom was Ben Ferencz, who, as you all know, is the sole surviving prosecutor from the Nuremberg trials. During his opening statements in 1947, Mr. Ferencz said, quote, "We ask this court to affirm by international penal action man's right to live in peace and dignity regardless of his race or creed. The case we present is a plea of humanity to law." I had the pleasure of attending the award ceremony last year, and while there, Mr. Ferencz gave me a copy of an article he had written in 2003, not long after the Rome Statute had entered into force. Here are some of the words written more than 50 years after his opening statement in Nuremberg. "The temple of the law has been built one stone upon the other. Unfortunately, the edifice upon which the peace and tranquility of humankind rests is far from complete. The world has not yet grasped the reality that law is better than war." He went on to conclude his article by saying, quote, "The rule of law remains the best hope for the protection of humankind." We have come a long way since 1947 and since 2003. But as we have heard over these last few days, there is still much work to be done. And just as the work that has brought us this far was not done by one person, but by individuals creating an international community dedicated to the rule of law, so too will we respond to today's and tomorrow's challenges as a group, as allies in this work for a better, more just, more peaceful world. Reflecting on these ideas as an educator and contemplating the work done here, including our inclusion of and thoughtful discussions with high school, college, and law students yesterday during our breakouts made me think of some other words, these from Toni Morrison, who died earlier this month. And so I will close with these. She said, quote, "I tell my students, when you get these jobs that you have been so brilliantly trained for, just remember that your real job is that if you are free, you need to free somebody else. If you have some power, then your job is to empower somebody else." And I will now read this year's first Chautauqua Principles. In the spirit of humanity and peace, recognizing that in today's challenging legal and political environment, it is important to consider how the international criminal justice system and individual practitioners can provide justice for victims of atrocity crimes. To that end, the following principles are offered to practitioners, diplomats, and politicians grappling with these challenges. Principle 1. The future of the international criminal justice system must include a role for international courts and tribunals, including the International Criminal Court. To ensure such institutions function independently, effectively, and efficiently, we must foster realistic expectations among the victims of crimes and the international community. We must ensure such courts are not improperly influenced by political leaders or movements. We must promote consistency in the investigation and adjudication of atrocity situations, realizing some degree of diversity across the international criminal justice system is healthy, and as it can reflect the unique needs of hybrid national and international systems. We must refine the process for the selection of judges and establish mandatory training. We must ensure adequate resources are provided to such institutions to enable them to carry out their mandates. Principle 2. We must continue to enhance the framework of international criminal law by adopting, as appropriate, new international legal instruments. Principle 3. The practice of international criminal law requires a principled yet practical approach, focusing on broad international norms without insisting upon rigid uniformity as to irreconcilable differences, which could subvert otherwise legitimate efforts to combat impunity. Principle 4. We must recognize the value of international, impartial, and independent mechanisms as a means of advancing international criminal justice. However, we must recognize that such mechanisms are information collection entities, not accountability mechanisms. Thus, they are valuable tools and resources, but not an alternative to international tribunals and courts. Principle 5. It is essential that the international criminal justice system develop processes to coordinate its efforts with the efforts of grassroots activists and civil society organizations in every existing atrocity situation. Such processes must include minimizing the duplication of effort, facilitating safe collaboration, and training human assets. Such coordination must also exist between grassroots activities and civil society organizations with diverse aims and objectives. Principle 6. Technology and social media have drastically increased the volume of available information pertaining to atrocity crimes. We must ensure adequate procedures exist to properly authenticate such information. Modern technology may enable such procedures. We must also explore whether traditional notions of the indicia of reliability should be re-evaluated within the confines of due process to encompass new means of authentication. Principle 7. We must condemn nationalist rhetoric that exploits fear, exaggerates differences, and erodes the coalitions which have served as the common thread for all advances in international criminal justice. Thus, we must condemn hate speech, disinformation, victim blaming, and the rhetoric asserting that solutions to domestic challenges permit the abdication of international legal obligations. We must redouble efforts to highlight the achievements of international accountability efforts, and remind everyone that challenges such as refugee migration are symptoms of the failure of accountability. I will now ask Brenda J. Hollis, as chair of the 13th International Humanitarian Law Roundtable, to witness and sign the first Chautauqua Principles dated August the 27th, 2019, and in doing so, as chair of the 13th International Humanitarian Law Roundtable, call upon the international community to keep the spirit of the Nuremberg Principles alive by calling to attention and putting into action the principles included herein.